Moments that defined history. History pivots on single moments when everything, absolutely everything, hangs by a thread. We remember the victories, celebrate the triumphs, and study the aftermath. But we rarely grasp just how close these world-changing events came to unraveling. 5 times in our past, leaders faced choices that would either immortalize or destroy them, with no middle ground and no way back. A river crossing that broke an empire. A palace coup that transformed China forever. 3 wooden ships sailing into the unknown. A flash of light in the New Mexico desert. 13 days when the world held its breath. These weren't just risks. They were existential gambles where the stakes were total. Victory or oblivion, glory or extinction, everything or nothing at all. In these pages, you'll walk alongside 5 people who stared into the abyss and jumped. Some were warriors, others scientists, one a low-born sailor with an impossible dream. Each of them shared one thing, a moment when they knew that hesitation meant defeat, that retreat meant failure, and that the only way forward was to push all their chips to the center of the table and let fate decide. Their stories aren't just about what happened. They're about what almost happened, what could have happened, and how razor-thin the line between catastrophe and triumph really is. This is the story of history's greatest gambles and the people who dared to make them. Caesar's fateful gamble, crossing the Rubicon. The tiny stream barely reached a soldier's knees. In summer, locals used it to water their goats. It wasn't deep or wide or particularly special, except for one thing. Crossing it with an army meant civil war, and Julius Caesar sat on its bank in the winter darkness of 49 BCE, knowing that the next few minutes would transform him into either the most powerful man in history or its most famous traitor. Behind him stood the battle-hardened 13th Legion, their red cloaks dark in the night. They'd followed him through 8 years of brutal fighting in Gaul, trusting him when the odds seemed impossible. Now they waited, weapons ready, breath frosting in the January air. Ahead lay Italy, forbidden to any general leading troops. The Senate had delivered their ultimatum: disband your army or be declared an enemy of Rome. There would be no compromise, no negotiation, no middle path. Caesar had spent the evening in the frontier town of Ravenna, dining with his officers while secretly mobilizing his men. Over plates of oysters and wine, they debated the odds of success. Pompey, his rival, commanded 5 times as many legions. The Senate backed him. The Roman treasury stood behind him. To win, Caesar would need to move with lightning speed, reaching Rome before his enemies could marshal their forces. One mistake, one delay, and he joined the long line of failed revolutionaries whose heads adorned the Forum. But he saw something his enemies didn't. Decades of corruption had rotted the Republic from within. The common people were ready for change. His soldiers believed in him with religious intensity. And his opponents, wealthy and powerful as they were, had grown soft. Still, no one had ever succeeded at what he was about to attempt. The fate of Rome and of Western civilization itself balanced on the edge of a sword. Standing up from the riverbank, Caesar uttered the words that would echo through history. "The die is cast." Then he stepped into the stream, his boots breaking the surface of the Rubicon, and the world changed forever. Within hours, his army was marching south. Within days, panic gripped Rome as senators fled the city. Within months, he would control most of Italy. But in that frozen moment, as water swirled around his ankles, even Julius Caesar couldn't know if he was marching toward empire or extinction. The civil war he launched that night would consume the Roman world for 4 years. Cities would burn. Armies would clash across 3 continents. The republic that had stood for 5 centuries would crumble. And from its ashes would rise an empire that would shape the next 2,000 years of human history. All because one man looked into the darkness and decided to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. Wu Zetian, the rise of China's first female emperor. Morning light streamed through the silk curtains of China's Forbidden City as Wu Zetian prepared to seize an empire. For decades, she had moved like a ghost through the palace corridors, rising from low-ranking concubine to imperial consort. Now, in 690 CE, she sat before her bronze mirror making the final preparations for history's boldest coup. Her enemies called her the Serpent, but they never understood. In the deadly game of Tang Dynasty politics, survival meant striking first. Outside her chambers, 10,000 palace guards stood ready, their loyalties carefully cultivated through years of bribes, promises, and carefully orchestrated acts of kindness. Her own sons, the legitimate heirs to the throne, had been systematically pushed aside. Some called it ruthless. She called it necessary. In a world where women were expected to remain silent and submissive, Wu had built a shadow empire of spies, scholars, and loyal administrators. Every piece was in place. The night before, she had hosted an elaborate feast for China's most powerful nobles. As they drank the finest wines and watched dancers perform ancient rituals, none suspected that many of them would end the next day in chains. Wu had spent years collecting evidence of their corruption, real and manufactured. Her network of informants had documented every scandal, every secret meeting, every whispered plot. Now those documents sat in sealed scrolls, ready to destroy reputations that had stood for generations. But her true masterstroke lay in what happened next. Instead of simply seizing power, Wu proclaimed herself the living incarnation of Maitreya Buddha, a messianic figure prophesied to bring a new age of enlightenment. It was outrageous, blasphemous, and brilliant. Religious fervor swept through the streets as Buddhist temples proclaimed her divine right to rule. Who could deny the throne to a living Buddha? By sunset, Wu Zetian had done the impossible. The Tang Dynasty's male monopoly on power lay shattered. China bowed before its first and only female emperor, not as a usurper, but as a divine ruler ordained by heaven itself. From her throne in the newly renamed Divine Capital, she launched reforms that would transform Chinese society, promoted talent over nobility, and created a secret police force so effective that even breathing criticism of her rule became deadly dangerous. Her enemies had sneered at the thought of a woman wielding supreme power. Now they knelt before her, discovering too late that in their determination to keep a woman from the throne, they had helped create the most formidable ruler China had ever seen. Wu Zetian's gamble had paid off. She would rule for 15 years, longer than anyone thought possible, and change the face of Chinese civilization forever. The peasant girl who entered the palace as a concubine had become the daughter of heaven itself, and she was just getting started. Columbus's bold gamble. A new world awaits. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams of Granada's Alhambra Palace as Christopher Columbus made his last desperate bid for glory. The Spanish court had rejected him 6 times already. His theories about sailing west to reach Asia were considered absurd. His demanded titles and privileges were called outrageous. But on this January morning in 1492, as King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella celebrated their victory over the Moors, Columbus knew this was his final chance. In his worn leather satchel lay the most ambitious sales pitch in history. 3 tiny ships to change the world. The timing was perfect, though the stakes were lethal. Spain had just spent a fortune defeating the Moors, but victory meant they needed a new path to glory. Portugal dominated the African coast. The Silk Road was controlled by hostile powers. If Columbus was right about sailing west, Spain would control a direct route to the riches of Asia. If he was wrong, 3 ships and their crews would vanish into the endless Atlantic, never to be seen again. He had already been laughed out of the royal courts of Portugal, England, and France. Spain was his last hope. Standing before the monarchs, Columbus unleashed decades of pent-up obsession. He wasn't just offering them a trade route, he was offering them destiny. His calculations promised Asia was just 3,000 miles west. He was wrong by over 7,000 miles, but his passionate certainty proved infectious. Queen Isabella, fresh from conquering Granada, saw in his eyes the same fire that had driven her to unite Spain. Here was a man willing to sail off the edge of the known world, convinced that glory awaited on the other side. The court scholars called him mad. The royal advisors recommended against it. The price he demanded, hereditary titles, 10% of all wealth discovered, governorship of any lands found, was unprecedented. Yet something in his absolute conviction gave Isabella pause. As Columbus turned to leave, believing he had failed again, she made the decision that would reshape the world. Spain would gamble on this obsessed Genoese sailor and his wild dreams of glory. Within 8 months, 3 tiny ships, none longer than a modern tennis court, set sail into the unknown. The Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina carried 87 men toward what they thought was Asia. Instead, they sailed into legend. Columbus was wrong about almost everything. The size of the Earth, the distance to Asia, the nature of what he would find. But his wrongness would prove far more valuable than being right. His true discovery wasn't a new route to Asia, it was an entirely new world, waiting to change everything humanity thought it knew about itself. The Manhattan Project and the birth of the atomic age. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 16, 1945, Robert Oppenheimer stood in a bunker 10,000 yards from ground zero, his hands gripping a steel post. For 3 years, he had driven the greatest collection of scientific minds in history toward this moment. Now, as the seconds ticked down to detonation, an unspeakable fear gripped the observers. What if their calculations were wrong? What if the atmospheric ignition theory was correct, and this test would set the planet's air itself on fire, burning away all life on Earth? The numbers said it was safe. The greatest physicists alive had checked and rechecked every equation. But no one had ever split an atom in an exponential chain reaction of this magnitude before. The desert night was silent except for the low hum of equipment and the sound of nervous scientists reciting odds in whispered voices. Enrico Fermi, brilliant and eccentric, was taking bets on whether the explosion would destroy just New Mexico or the entire world. Edward Teller was coating himself with sunscreen, either brilliantly prescient or completely mad. General Leslie Groves, the military commander of the Manhattan Project, had chosen this remote stretch of New Mexico desert precisely because it could be sacrificed if something went wrong. But wrong was a relative term when dealing with forces never before unleashed on Earth. The theoretical physics said the blast would equal 5,000 tons of TNT. The margin of error included the possibility of zero yield or something far more catastrophic. The Nazi threat had driven them to this point, forcing them to race against both Hitler's scientists and their own doubts about unleashing such power. At 5:29 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The desert night transformed into impossible day. A light brighter than 1,000 suns erupted from the tower. The blast wave hit the bunker like a physical force, and then came the sound, a roar that shook the earth itself. As the fireball rose, forming its now iconic mushroom cloud, Oppenheimer's mind turned to Hindu scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to him and said simply, "Now we are all sons of bitches." The Trinity test worked far better and far worse than anyone had dared imagine. The yield wasn't 5,000 tons of TNT, but 18,600. They had created a weapon that worked too well, unleashing forces that threatened to escape human control. In that moment of success, the scientists realized they had crossed a line that humanity could never uncross. Their gamble had paid off technically, but the moral implications would haunt them and all of humanity forever. The atomic age had begun with a flash of light in the desert, and nothing would ever be the same. The brink of nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Robert Kennedy stared at the aerial photographs spread across his brother's desk in the Oval Office. The images were grainy but unmistakable. Soviet nuclear missiles just 90 miles from Florida. In the next 13 days, every decision made in this room would determine whether humanity survived or vanished in a nuclear inferno. On October 16, 1962, the countdown to potential Armageddon began with a morning briefing and a simple question from the president. How did we miss this? The options were all bad. An airstrike might miss some missiles, leaving them ready to launch. A naval blockade might be seen as an act of war. Diplomacy could give the Soviets time to finish missile construction. And doing nothing was unthinkable. Every morning, the Joint Chiefs pushed for immediate military action, warning that each hour of delay brought another missile online. Every evening, intelligence reports detailed Soviet submarines moving into attack positions and bomber squadrons shifting to high alert. Inside the executive committee room, the tension crackled like static electricity. Sleep-deprived advisors chain-smoked through marathon strategy sessions, knowing that one wrong move would trigger World War III. U-2 spy planes flew daily missions over Cuba, their pilots knowing that a single Soviet surface-to-air missile could spark the conflict everyone feared. When one U-2 was shot down, Kennedy faced the moment every president dreaded. Immediate pressure to retaliate, with the fate of civilization hanging on his next word. The greatest gamble came on October 27th. 2 letters arrived from Khrushchev, one bellicose, one conciliatory. Against the advice of nearly everyone, Kennedy chose to ignore the threatening letter and respond to the peaceful one. It was either brilliant psychology or naive hope, and the difference meant extinction or survival. That same day, a Soviet submarine, depth-charged by US destroyers, nearly launched its nuclear torpedo. Only one Soviet officer's refusal to comply with launch orders prevented the end of the world. The crisis broke like a fever. Khrushchev announced the missiles would be withdrawn. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove obsolete US missiles from Turkey. Both sides claimed victory while privately shaking at how close they'd come to the edge. In the aftermath, the Moscow-Washington hotline was installed, and the Cold War entered a new phase. The world's closest brush with nuclear war had come down to a series of knife-edge decisions, any one of which could have gone catastrophically wrong. Instead, humanity survived, by luck, by skill, and by the wisdom to know when to step back from the brink. The courage to gamble. Transformative decisions in history. Generals quip that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. Yet what our 5 stories reveal is something far more profound. The greatest gambles in history were won not by sticking to plans, but by recognizing moments when everything, tradition, caution, even sanity itself, had to be thrown aside for a single, all-or-nothing bet. Caesar didn't just cross a stream. He shattered the unwritten rules that had held a republic together for 5 centuries. Wu Zetian didn't merely seize power, she rewrote the divine mandate of heaven itself. Columbus sailed into a void that most believed would kill him. Oppenheimer's team played dice with the atmosphere of Earth. Kennedy and Khrushchev wagered the entire human species on a game of nuclear poker. These weren't just decisions. They were transformative acts that bent the arc of history through sheer audacity. But here's what makes them truly extraordinary. In each case, the safer choice was obvious. Caesar could have disbanded his army and lived as a wealthy ex-general. Wu could have remained a powerful dowager empress. Columbus could have settled for a merchant's life. The Manhattan Project scientist could have worked on conventional weapons. Kennedy could have bombed Cuba back to the Stone Age. The responsible choice lay clear before each of them. Yet they saw something others missed, moments when playing it safe was more dangerous than risking everything. They recognized that history's greatest opportunities don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive disguised as impossible choices, asking us whether we have the courage to throw the dice just once, for the highest stakes imaginable. What separates a madman from a visionary? Perhaps only success. Yet these 5 moments teach us something vital about the nature of world-changing decisions. They're rarely made with complete information, perfect timing, or absolute certainty. They're made because someone looked into the abyss of uncertainty and decided that the risk of action was better than the certainty of regret. As our world faces new existential gambles, climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, these lessons become more vital than ever. The next world-changing gamble won't look exactly like crossing the Rubicon or testing an atomic bomb. But somewhere, someone will face a moment when everything hangs in the balance. And the future will pivot on their courage to cast the die.